So greetings to everyone. Hello, my name is Amy Krappel, and I am the director of the UF Center for European Studies. Our center is a Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center and a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our discussion today is recorded and it will be available on the UFCES website shortly. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and participants can submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screens. We encourage you to use the Q&A function rather than the chat window, as it facilitates our management of the questions and ensures that we won't accidentally miss your question. Again, thank you for joining us today to discuss immigrant rights and integration in Europe. The panel is part of the UF Center for European Studies virtual series, The Migration Experience in Europe, Integration, Inclusion, and Exclusion. This panel and the virtual series are supported by our Title VI National Resource Center grant. The next panel in the series is scheduled for next Wednesday, April 7th, on immigrant case studies of inclusion and exclusion. And for details on the other upcoming talks in the series, you can visit ces.ufl.edu. If you would like us to email you information directly, you can put that information in the chat window and we will email you directly. Our panel today includes Dr. Roxana Barbulescu, who is Associate Professor in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. Her area of expertise focuses on migrant communities and practices on migration and mobility in connection with migrant and refugee rights. Next, we have Dr. Rainer Baubock, who is a professor in global governance program at the European University Institute's Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. I spent a lot of time at EUI, so I'm jealous that he is there perpetually. He co-directs the Global CIT program, which is an online observatory on citizen and voting rights. Dr. Sara Wallace Goodman is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. Her research examines democratic citizenship and the shaping of political identity through immigrant integration, and all of our panelists' full bios are available on the event page, and they will be available with the recording if you'd like some more information. Moderating today's panel discussion is my colleague, Dr. Hannah Alarian, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida, and an affiliate at the UF Center for European Studies and the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship. And with that, I will hand the panel over to our moderator, Dr. Alarian. I do want to remind everyone that at the end of the talk, you will be funneled directly to a survey, and we request that you kindly complete the short survey, which very much helps us in our future planning and understanding of interest in our events. Dr. Alarian.
Okay. Well, thank you to Amy for that introduction, and to all of our panelists and audience for being here today. Our panelists today are some of the most prominent voices in the study of European immigrant integration, citizenship, and migration broadly. And so I'm incredibly honored to be here today moderating alongside these incredibly important voices. So each panelist today is bringing a unique perspective to the broader questions of immigrant integration and immigrant rights. First, we'll begin with Sara Wallace Goodman, who will situate our understanding of who gets citizenship, the trajectory of such policies, and the consequences of citizenship itself. Next, Rainer Baubock will speak on Europe's missing temporary migration policy, highlighting their political and normative implications. And finally, Roxana Barbulescu will provide insight from an ongoing project interrogating the Windrush affair in the aftermath of Brexit, considering migrant rights and lives after 50 years of integration. At the conclusion of the panel, I'll open it up to audience Q&A, moderated by yours truly. Without further ado, I'll hand this virtual microphone, I guess, over to Dr. Sara Wallace Goodman.
Okay, so I took this as an invitation to think broadly, holistically about the field of integration studies, about the question of who gets citizenship, critically about policy and policy design, and kind of where we are as a field as we study it, and sort of maybe some suggestions about how we move forward. So it was a real opportunity for me to think kind of about the state of affairs of integration policy studies. So I want to start with three trends. I'm going to highlight three trends, which I think orients orients how we think about integration today. First is the shift in meaning of integration itself. What integration means today is different than what it means or meant 10 years ago. And we as a group of political scientists should think critically about how this shift might affect our studies. The second shift is the trade-off. We see an expansion of rights and the contraction of membership. So as less people get citizenship, we do see the expansion of rights in other areas. So how does that reshape our thinking about integration as a second trend? And then the third is the recalibration of national politics. What the shift to the right, both at the national level and at the EU level, the technocratic shift towards at the EU level, what does this mean for studying integration? How do we toggle between empirical and normative concerns as we approach our work? So it's about positionality as a researcher. It's about studying empirics and how we move forward in studying the outcomes that we care about, which is who gets citizenship and why. So the first trend is this integration shift. What does that mean? So I wrote, I hate the phrase over a decade ago, because that dates me in a certain way. But I started to research this idea about integration over a decade ago in comparing what were called civic integration policies. And I use the past tense for that because the term itself is preserved, but the idea behind it has really shifted. So this is a set of policies and it's a philosophy that emerged in sort of the death knell of multiculturalism stage. So in the mid 90s, early 2000s, politicians, academics were talking about, multiculturalism is over, right? It leads to parallel lives, to invoke Trevor Phillips's language. And so out of this was this shift in thinking that we moved from group-based recognition to kind of individual autonomy, right? That we treat people not as groups, but as individuals, and we help them integrate by obtaining these sort of individual skills. So that was kind of the idea when these policies first started to roll out, right, in Denmark, the Netherlands, France. We sort of saw them broadly across Western Europe. And so what we see in the past 20 years or so is this switch from, again, like group-based accommodation to kind of individual investments. But even that then, it has shifted itself, moved from a logic of assistance and engagement-oriented policies to what I'm calling a club philosophy. So the philosophy of civic integration has changed. So when we ask the question about who gets citizenship, right, it's about people that can demonstrate alignment to club philosophy, club principles. So not only has the philosophy shifted, but the kind of appeals that are used in this policy area has shifted as well. They're very emotional now, right? So, I was just reading, I think it was an op-ed by Ricky van Oors, who, she quoted a Danish politician saying, becoming a Danish citizen is something that one has to become worthy of. Well, like that's something that French policymakers told me 15 years ago, right? So we kind of see this alignment of philosophy about, it's not about obtaining individual skill set, but it's really about emotional appeals and aligning to a set of group preferences. This is also what people used to say about Gordon Brown, that he had this very different definition of what it means to be British versus kind of the rest of the Home Office policymakers that were very focused on making people autonomous and helping them obtain skills to move about society, right? But so we see this shift in emotional appeals. So now there's ample evidence that these tools produce short-term gains, so language acquisition, but they have long-term exclusionary consequences, right? They decrease the number of people that can obtain permanent residence or citizenship. So we have to balance between these short-term gains and these long-term goals. Which leads to the second trend. So the first is that we see the shift both in what the philosophy of integration is, the repurposing of the tools that we use to obtain integration. So we've really completed the link between membership tools and integration control. The second shift is that this trade-off exists. So as citizenship becomes harder to get, and as the philosophy linked with citizenship becomes more exclusionary, we do see this kind of proliferation of policies and studies of these policies that see integration in other areas. So if citizenship is going to be this exclusionary restrictive club, we do see that things happen around that club, beneath that club, right, alongside that club. Things like economic rights, so labor market access or unemployment benefits or social assistance or local voting rights, all these things are happening. I think it invites us to take a more inductive approach to the study of integration, kind of as a set of researchers, right? Than just looking sort of starkly at integration policies. But things are happening around citizenship that I think can produce the kind of integration outcomes that we're interested in. Of course, this is by design, this trade-off setup. It maintains these tiers of belonging. So immigration has increased in the past decade, but citizenship either stabilizes or decreases, right? So it has halved in the Netherlands, right, since introduction of integration requirements. It enables a kind of renationalization of integration or belonging while still complying with kind of vague European principles. And it allows for kind of this exclusionary practice to continue. So we have the trade-off, we have the shift in integration philosophy, and then the last is this recalibration of national politics. This is the context in which integration takes place. And the context is simply not the same as it was a decade ago. We have a general kind of dominance across the continent, which practices, really strict practices of integration, which is a real unipolarity of the right. Not saying that it's all right, center right governments in power, but that center right and far right parties are agenda setters when it comes to integration policies. So you see the social democratic led government introduce the language test in Sweden, right, supported by the moderate party. You see another language increase in the Netherlands in the run up to the election, changes in Germany and Austria and Switzerland. Like, these are all examples, and I could go on, but just how the center and the far right really predominate, not just kind of on the national, at the national level, but in terms of setting the agenda when it comes to thinking about integration. Programmatically, we have a lot of research that shows how this pulls everybody to the right. So I said this is at both recalibration, the context of integration at the national level, but also then at the EU level. We have seen an unprecedented tolerance for authoritarianism at the EU level. This in the context of a global democratic backsliding. We need to think, I think it invites, so here's a second invitation for researchers. I think it really invites us to ask the question about how a technocracy promotes immigrant integration, what we expect of the EU in terms of setting common basic principles or applying common basic principles. And evidence shows that the EU is not a force for harmonizing national citizenship law. It's not even a force for harmonizing local voting rights. I think Hannah's work shows that. But it begs us to think about the context in which integration takes place and in which these policies are practiced. So I take these three trends and I think about how that sets an agenda for thinking about the study of citizenship and the study of integration requirements. And this is my last point. I realize we're short on time. So I want to think about how these changes impact migration research and research ethics. So making citizenship more valuable has inevitably made it harder to get. This creates obvious asymmetries among the population that wants to obtain citizenship, right? Disproportionate impact on low educated, perpetuates economic and social inequality. So given that, we need to think about integration as something that can be achieved without the citizenship premium, right? I sometimes characterize this as meeting governments where they're at. And this, of course, invites researchers to think about what the goal of their research is. Is it to push governments? Is it to empirically document what is happening in the world, right? These positions are not the same across research communities. And I think it requires sort of explicit language when we think about how we write up and share our research. And so given given kind of these empirical shifts, I think it invites new kinds of research agendas. So I thought I'd just briefly highlight some of the things I think are interesting. We may not agree, the things I like to read and review, right? So I think this is an inductive call. What I see is that studying and theorizing integration outside of the traditional integration path, right? It's not a debate about a catalyst or crown. There are catalysts everywhere. It's kind of inductively seeing those catalysts. We need to think about other ways to deliver the goods of citizenship if governments are not going to be giving citizenship, right? I mean, there are some empirical realities that I think we need to navigate around. So what does this mean? I think we have a lot of research on macro behavioral and institutional shifts and policy outputs. I'm really interested in bringing immigrant voices into the story to tell us about outcomes. This is a difficult space, though, which may be one of the reasons why political science does not do more of it. Migrants become even more vulnerable when policies become more restrictive. These are not just data, these are people. And I don't think that we have sufficient research ethics to think critically about how we study these populations in political science. So I think this invites a conversation about how we talk about ethics beyond IRB. The UK, for example, is having a reckoning with audit studies right now, right? Some kind of work is kosher, but does that make it ethical? We're trained to study certain kinds of things. I don't think that's necessarily the kind of granular information on mechanisms and outcomes that we really want to know about integration. And then sort of I think the last point is that as we toggle between evaluating empirical and normative costs and benefits, we want to think more about intersectionality, that we can't study race as separate from status. I see Terry Givens is in this call, and so I would point you to her work, right? So the race report today, for example, right, just to link the news back in, says there's no institutional racism in the UK, right? It's all personal, individual level. Like, so it's not just about studying things at the granular level and talking to people, but it's also thinking about how we study policies in a political environment that has a different goal that maybe researchers have. So I think that characterizing our definitions of integration as different from that of the governments in which we are studying is important. What do I mean by that? Again, that's an invitation for being explicit about positionality. Best case scenario is academics think of integration as equity, and best case scenario is governments think of integration as non-dependency. Worst case scenario is integration as a type of exclusion, control, or paternalism. So I think that that's probably my time. And maybe that last point is a little provocative. I'm happy to talk about it later, but I think that the fields of migration studies and citizenship is stronger than ever. And I think that invites a greater onus on us as researchers to think about our role in studying real policies and the implications of those policies. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So just as a note to continue to type questions into the Q&A, even if Terry, even if Sarah preempted your question, please still put that question in the Q&A. Appreciate it. And our next speaker will be Rainier.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hannah. Sara just alluded to the problem, the shift in integration policies and the more exclusionary drift since the Civic term that she has studied so well. And I want to talk more about the immigration side. And I think the two are connected. Part of the explanation for the drift or shift in integration policies has to do with at least the public perception of Europe's immigration dilemmas, and its failure to come up with a reasonable immigration policy that could have wider public acceptance. So without any doubt, demographically speaking, the EU as a whole has become an immigration continent on a par with North America or Australia and New Zealand. But there is a public perception of a loss of control over immigration, and that has to do with the main forms of immigration. You look at Europe, a lot of immigration inside the EU is free movement. so it's exempted from national control. Then you have the inflow of asylum seekers and refugees that peaked in 2015, 2016. That was again perceived publicly as something that is completely out of control. And then you have family reunification to the prior inflows of migrants and refugees. And again, you know, there is a human right to family reunification, and the courts step in, and then the policymakers feel, well, we can't really do much to control it. And the rest of it is perceived to be unwanted, irregular migration. And that's what the debate focuses on. So loss of control is the first symptom there. The second is the experience of the failure of the EU in the refugee crisis, in the so-called refugee crisis, that still hasn't been resolved until today. Last year, the EU Commission made a new proposal how to rebuild solidarity in sharing refugee responsibility, but it's very shaky and it's not sure that this will succeed. And finally, and this is what Sara talked about, there is the perception of integration failure. This is not just a drift towards more exclusion, but there is the perception that there's a large group of immigrants, and this is specifically about Muslims, that haven't been integrated well. So they are seen as a security problem, as a cultural threat, as something that is incompatible with European values, and this is what the discourse focuses on. So there is something that is surprisingly absent in this whole debate, and this is wanted immigration of a legal kind, and also of a temporary kind that many other states engage in. The EU has been talking for a long time about the need for migration development partnerships with African sub-Saharan states that would bring in people on a temporary basis, help them get some skills, earn some money, send back remittances, and it would be beneficial for them and for Europe. But these programs haven't got out off the ground, and they are not really part of the phenomenon of immigration that is debated in public. So I felt, you know, I started studying immigration in the period of the late guest worker policies in the 1970s and early 80s. This goes back that long. The outcome of this was not a happy one. Probably a bit similar with the Bracero program in the US. So there was a critique of the experience of the guest worker programs, both from the left and from the right, that led to the conclusion, Stephen Castle formulated it, I think in the late 80s, an obituary to the guest worker, and it shouldn't be revived in a new form. On the left side, the critique was that guest worker programs create dual labor markets that are segmented and consolidate low wage sectors focusing on 3D kinds of work, so dirty, dangerous, demeaning, and demanding too. Remember also the critique by Michael Wallace and others that guest worker programs were premised on the idea that there wouldn't be integration because they were supposed to be rotated, sent back to their countries of origin, and access to citizenship was excluded. On the right, you know, the critique was that de facto the guest worker programs ended in unwanted and unintended immigration because the employers wanted to keep their labor forces, didn't want to rotate and train new ones. The migrants brought in their families, so they settled for good and they became new minorities. And those new minorities on the cultural conservative right are perceived as a threat to homogeneous, presumably homogeneous European nation states. And here again, the focus is very much on Muslims. Now, I thought it's worth looking again, having a second look at temporary migrant worker programs and what could possibly justify them and whether in the present situation they could actually be helpful if they were well designed according to defensible normative guidelines. But the first thing we have to do in Europe is, I think, attack and abandon the ideal of sovereign immigration control in liberal democracies. You know, just going through the list of the various types of immigration flows, the conclusion from a normative perspective is obvious. It's not that nation states can control or should be seen as being able to control immigration overall, but they have to be, immigrants claimed to admission have to be broken down into different categories. And as you go by the categories, for each of one, you see what the constraints are on defensible forms of control. So first, you have in the EU citizenship-based free movement. If I'm an Austrian national, therefore I'm an EU citizen, I have a right to move and settle to any other EU state. And that is normatively defensible, but it undermines the immigration control of the other EU member states. That, by the way, goes also for the proliferation of dual citizenship. It creates more and more people that have rights of free movement between several states that are outside of state control. The second stream of migration is asylum seekers and refugees. And here, you have human rights, the Geneva Refugee Convention, plus international duties towards other states in responsibility sharing. So again, there is the perception, and rightly so, that this shouldn't be under sovereign control, and it's not to be deplored. It calls for state collaboration rather than national sovereignty. Thirdly, you have family reunification, where a human right to family life combines with the rights of denizens, of those of the anchor persons who, as permanent residents, have a right to bring in their families. Again, very little control that states can exercise legitimately, at least in liberal democracies. And then you have a type of immigration that is actually seen as wanted. The calculus is usually a utilitarian one, and I think for right reasons. International students, retirement migrants, highly skilled migrants, golden visa regimes for investors. Here, the assumption is it's beneficial for the individual migrant, and it doesn't pose a problem or is beneficial for the host society too. There is virtually no concern whatsoever in discussing these migration streams about the interests of the countries of origin. So this is where the debate is. Now, if we move to the missing piece of the puzzle, the temporary labor migration programs, I think the normative justification is different for them again, and it ought to be a triple benefit. This is part of the established discourse also in the EU. Since 2005, the EU Commission has been proposing triple benefit based labor migration, temporary labor migration programs. But I think triple benefit needs to be taken seriously. What it means, it ought to be beneficial not only for the host society and for the migrant, but also for the country of origin. And that means issues of global justice, of development cooperation between the global north and the global south must be built into the very design of these programs if they are ever to be justified and also effective in their own terms. So just going through the list, what the triple benefit would mean for each of the three types of actors. For destination countries, it's rather obvious, feeling labor shortages that are still there or re-emerging again. In the past, in the 1960s, it was also very much about controlling inflation, the wage pressure. And there is a new discourse among economists that maybe because of the massive public spending during the pandemic and the possibility of an economic resurgence at the end of this, there may be a strong inflation pressure that could be partly mitigated through temporary migration programs. And finally, and most importantly, I think for the host country, it would mean reducing the pressure for irregular migration by offering legal channels that are supposed to be beneficial also for the host country. Now, for the migrants, what makes temporary migration programs attractive is primarily the difference in living costs between countries of origin and countries of destination. So the idea that you earn a wage that you can actually cash in your country of origin when you return or when you engage in a circular pattern of migration is very attractive economically. It means that even if the wage is low at destination, it may provide you with significant benefits at origin. There is a benefit of human capital upgrading, skills that are acquired at destination. And finally, also that there is development. So sorry, I've already jumped now to the source countries. So speaking about migrants, their interest is also to increase their social prestige in origin. And very often migrants, it's not the poorest of the poor who are interested in these programs, but it's people who have temporary migration life projects. They want to go to Europe, they want to go to the north, they want to spend some time there, earn some money there for economic reasons, but not only for economic reasons. Post-colonial theorists have suggested it may be even an urge to, turn upside down the colonial relation by going to the colonizer, the former colonizer, and seeing what it's like and benefiting from the situation in the metropolis. And offering legal channels for that opportunity reduces the risks because there is a lot of evidence that people are willing to invest a lot of money and take high risks to their lives in order to achieve that goal of reaching Europe. So if you know that, I think that's a very good reason for offering legal channels that would take out the pressure from these irregular ones where trafficking is the name of the game. Finally, for source countries, the benefit is very clear in remittances, upgrading of human capital if these people return with additional skills, and development cooperation. You can strike a deal with the destination country that it does send development aid as part of the package that includes also legal migration slots for its citizens. Now, of course, there are problems too. And as has been discussed a lot in the literature, thinking of people like Phil Martin or Martin Rose, there's a trade-off between numbers and rights. And some global utilitarians have argued, in fact, it's entirely justified to keep the rights of temporary migrant workers at a very, very low level so that their numbers can be maximized. I want to reject that argument because it might lead to a justification of the kafala system in the Gulf states. Many more people benefit from the temporary labor migration opportunities in the Gulf states, but at the price of extreme forms of exploitation and insecurity that would be plainly unacceptable in Europe because they would undermine the rule of law and the social standards that are rightly cherished there. I also think it's not right to think about temporary migration as being, something that approximates as a substitute open borders. If most people, if the numbers could be maximized, that would be best. Actually, I think it's not about maximizing numbers, but it's about combining in the destination countries domestic duties that welfare states have engaged in securing certain levels of income and labor standards and welfare, combining these duties with their duties of global justice towards the global south. The point is, if we just think about the global justice duties as what the political philosophers call supererogatory ones that you have to do, although it costs you a lot, right? Then that won't win public support. But if you can show that there are things that you can do to deliver your global justice duties that will include benefits to yourself too, then that removes the excuse. So the triple benefit formula should be the perfect one in order to make it plausible that there is something that can be done, but if you bring in migrants that come from the global south. That has implications for the governance of temporary migration programs. It means they can't be governed bilaterally, because then they will be dominated by the host societies, by the destination states, as the guest worker programs were. Just maximizing the interests of European countries will lead to unacceptable forms of migration policy governance. Instead, you need to call in international organizations. You need forms of international governance of these programs to make them justifiable. And thirdly, very importantly, since we are talking about triple benefits, you can't leave out the migrants in the governance structure itself. And that's the biggest conundrum. The destination states and the origin states can be represented under the umbrella of an international organization. But what about the migrants, and who takes care of their interests? And therefore, you would need international organizations that have a mandate to represent the interests of temporary migrants in negotiating the types of rights, the numbers, the conditions for the temporary labor migration programs. So I'll stop there. That's my conclusions. I think that well-designed temporary migration programs could strengthen economic development and democratization in sub-Saharan Africa. They could reduce the demand for human trafficking by opening alternative legal migration channels, and they could alleviate fears about loss of control and stigmatization of Africans as irregular migrants. But they are not a panacea. There are things that they cannot do. And this is resolve free movement and refugee admission dilemmas that have erupted in 2015. Neither can they accommodate fears about demographic change, diversity, and openness. On the contrary, they will contribute to this. They will make Europe even more open than it already is. But that is something that we need to fight for. You know, that needs to be politically embraced by telling Europeans, this is your benefit too. But it comes at the price of accepting that Europe has become an immigration continent and ever more diverse as a result of this. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, especially keeping in trend with ending on a quite provocative note for us to consider. Appreciate that. And our final speaker today, Roxana.
Yes. Good afternoon, or good afternoon, I believe now in all our locations. Thank you for joining us this evening. So what I thought I will do, now we know each other a little bit, our work with Sara and Irvine, and it's really lovely to have this conversation this afternoon. But what I thought I would do is just bring a little bit closer to the conversations and the voices, because that of those people who have been experiencing the consequences of integration. So in my work, and you know, I've been looking at recently arrived migrants, so those who in pre-naturalization and their stage and their transition to as they move across the different poles and critically address these poles. But I found myself recently working on a project with colleagues, and I will mention here also with Adrian Pavel, in doing also interviews with the Windrush generation in Britain. And I found myself that particularly in this conversation and in the interviews with them that are long oral history interviews, it does make me think a lot more about integration and citizenship, particularly through the light of the recent Windrush scandal, which is still ongoing. So we wouldn't call it Windrush scandal had it been an affair that it had been sorted out. So this is the third year that the situation continues. There is an open Windrush compensation scheme that is highly problematic, and there's been a revisited, completely redesigned in December, promising automatic payments for as a threshold when a claimant is recognized, and then going into more detail on personal cases. So just to clear the backlog, but there are many, many, many concerns around this. And as I said before, I wanted to bring you into the conversations that I hear in talking with those in the Windrush generation. So I'm just gonna share now. So I'm just gonna, as I said before, in the conversations with them, it got me thinking, and I wanted to bring this example as a site of learning about integration and migrant rights. And to start a little bit, we're all thinking about this nexus of citizenship and integration, and particularly how it pertains to citizenship. We've all done work on naturalization, but look in particular at instances where we learn from, like statelessness, citizenship deprivation, citizenship renunciation. And this is where I think that the Windrush scandal comes as a learning site, because it does establish a new category. It's not citizenship deprivation. It's kind of ignorance, citizenship forgotten, or forgotten citizenship in some sort. So just to introduce briefly the case for those that are not very familiar with the situation. So the Windrush generation refers to those who have arrived between 48 and 73 in Britain. At the time, the empire was still, the Commonwealth, the Caribbean countries were part of the empire. There's a typo. 1948 Act gives citizenship and the right to vote to all the citizens of the colonies in the UK. And in 1940, the name comes in particular from the arrival of a ship, of a very particular ship that only carried 800 to 500, there is dispute of how many were on board, but the arrival of that dispute played a role in the national imaginary, in the sense that at the time it provoked great interest, curiosity. Newspapers sent people on boats to meet the ship as it was closing by and bring pictures of the ship. There was the then Labour government had to reiterate that they are British citizens, they have to be allowed to land. And it caused great interest at the time. There is also a powerful post-war legacy at the moment, at that particular point in time, because the Windrush Empire ship is a German cruise ship that was captured in the post-war. And when they arrived, because they had no plans on how to organize their life on arrival, it was just a very big opportunity to get on the ship. It was a one-way ship. Everyone booked a one-way ship. The staff, the crew was looking to fill up the boat, and they've offered a very reduced rate of £28 then for a one-way trip. So people didn't have the time to organize their travel to Britain. And there were many RAF soldiers that returned and arrived on this ship who had fought previously, and then they didn't have the jobs after many years or 2-3 years of work of fighting abroad. They didn't have the same jobs that they left. And when they arrived in Britain, in London, they were housed in shelter housing, and then that was the first point of entry, and then quickly moved into jobs covering the jobs that were available after the end of the war. In 1962, this regime ends, and people now have to apply. The new category is established that of subjects that are subject to immigration. So it is linked, the right to abode, the right to arrive in Britain and settle is linked with UK ancestry rather than nationality. I think that this is an important point, especially when we theorize around integration and nations. The nations that we have today are relatively young, most of them young, and increasingly in this troubled world, it's very difficult to only theorize citizenship as connected to the nation state when we see so many other variants emerging, to use the terminology that we have. 1971 Act, the Citizenship Act, further revises this relationship. It confirms the right to abode to Caribbean migrants from the Commonwealth, but it doesn't provide them with the documentation. It is applied only from 73, so there are 2 years of limbo in which people can apply. There was briefly a registration scheme in 87, but they made explicit then that there would be no consequences for those who wish to. So it was kind of, as we see today with the vaccine, it was presented as a choice that people had. And the consequences were particularly ruled out. Hostile environment is introduced in 2012, and the scandal emerges. There is an apology when it emerges from the Home Office, who resigns, and the task force is put in place, and it's tasked with the mission of making justice to the victims of the scheme, and then there's a compensation scheme put in place. A lot of people, over 12,000, apply for documentation, and for the compensation scheme, over 1,000 only in the first year, and the compensation scheme went really, really slow. So in 1 year, for example, only 90 cases were solved. There was an independent review published last year, and by Wendy Williams, and she concluded that the history of the Windrush generation was institutionally forgotten. and that it was driven, particularly to tie into what Sara said, by an organizational culture driven by targets, dominated by targets on immigration enforcement, daily targets, even as the civil servants mentioned. And just now to give you a flavor of how people are thinking through, and I think that what is also important is that Windrush has become a bipartisan issue. So if there are contestations on different things, Windrush has become a partisan issue and it has partisan support. And I think that this is interesting because we are establishing a new category that we didn't have before. So you not only have Black British, now you have also Windrush generation and descendants. And there are movements organized and activism organized around this new identity. And again, there is that public support because it is recognized as having a stand and a voice in the public space. So just to give you a flavor, here is an 80-year-old who arrived in 1961 because as the majority arrived between 1950 and in the 1950s and 60s, one 80-year-old male who arrived from Grenada, he said that he, in Grenada, was born under the British flag. At school, we were taught British curriculum. Our church is Anglican. How was I not British? The Windrush scandal is pure wrong. It should have been sorted there and then. Instead, the Home Office has been dragging its feet, and where we are now, nearly 4 years after. And just what I wanted to bring here is that this is not just for the first generation. Obviously, this creates a chain of people that are part of this issue. We have the second generation, people who were born in Britain, a woman in her 50s who says it was a mistake. It took people's identities away. Can you imagine to live your entire life, 30, 40 years, and one day you are told you are not British? Can you prove it? And it's starting to impact already the third generation because they are discovering it's not known that they will come over this passport. So this is a young child who was 12 and wanted to go on a school trip to Spain. And she couldn't because when she applied for the passport to join the school trip, she said that she didn't have the right to British passport. And to go back, how we report and how we work around these issues, just wanted to say as well, there is a lot of work to be done because even if you see, even on the left side is a left-wing newspaper, they are referred to as Windrush generation migrant, and they are not migrant. This is precisely what the scheme said. And still, this problem seems to continue. And just what I've learned, just to conclude, I think that what I've learned from this is that, if we look at the history, they've arrived as citizens. This legislation was passed even their arrival. And then we saw this continuous loss of rights for the subsequent generations, those who would have arrived later. And at the same time, we saw that they were part of it. So integration did happen. There were no problems around it. And still the scandal emerged and they were picked up because the hostile environment doesn't necessarily only address migrants. They were picked up as migrants by enforcement services. So I think that this is a really interesting point and look and revalue because there is a strong social justice agenda with integration and migrant rights, but also we have to look on how it fares to certain group, also monitor, not only look at the first arrivals, but monitor on the long-term effects of these policies.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. So this takes us to the Q&A portion. I'm going to rely on Corinne and Amy to let me know, to let us all know when we're kind of at time, because I could continue this conversation for as long as I'm allowed to, because these were such fascinating, and I'm sure everyone in the panel as well are interested in these questions. So please keep typing your questions into the Q&A. I see that Sara Wallace Goodman has already selected to answer a question from Vicky Van Er's live. So I'll hand this over to Sara.
Great. Hi, Ricky. So Ricky asks a great question. I can't pull it up right now because I have 800 screens open, but it's basically like, is it a good thing that we're seeing this expansion of rights outside of citizenship? And do I normatively think that's a good thing? So like, you know, in an ideal world, I would also not like voter disenfranchisement and repression in the United States, right? But like, there is ample evidence that shows that citizenship improves integration outcomes, right? There's ample evidence that shows that nudges work, reducing fees work, burden sharing schemes maximize labor market outcomes for, you know, asylum seekers in response to, you know, the 2015 crisis. The problem is governments don't have an appetite to implement any of these policies. Why is that a problem? Because like, maybe it's my pandemic brain, but like I like to work in the realm of the possible. So, you know, there's great paper by Kristen Simonson in Perspectives that shows that like even among Danish citizens with a minority background, they still experience vast discrimination. They still experience low political, they exhibit low political behavior because like some of these discriminatory effects don't disappear when you get citizenship. So I guess when I think narrow bore about what integration policies can do, I'm really excited about the idea of looking around citizenship if we recognize that the political landscape is one where, you know, as Roxana was saying, like even on the left wing, you see right-wing arguments, right? Language, rhetoric, frameworks. Like there is no left-wing argument for immigration. So like within that realm, how is it that we can match up the normative goals with the empirical reality?
Thanks. So there's another question here from Terry Givens to Rainier, asking about what the political incentives for a party to embrace a temporary migration scheme would be.
Which parties would have political incentives for backing temporary labor migration programs? My guess is liberal parties and green parties more than the others. Social democratic parties will be wavering because of the unions, and the culturally conservative and right-wing populist party will be strongly opposing this. However, I think there are examples where we see how this could work. Let me take Baden-Württemberg, which has a green but rather conservative green prime minister, recently won again the elections quite impressively. And they have been engaging in a project with the Gambia that would entail temporary labor migration schemes to Baden-Württemberg in return for the willingness by the Gambia to take back future irregular migrants from the Gambia that end up in Baden-Württemberg, with some kind of amnesty, I think, for those who are already there. So here's another reason that would it make it possible to sell these programs if they're also seen to curbing future irregular migration, which entails a willingness of the country of origins to take back people who then have a chance to apply through the legal channels. If that is seen to work successfully, then I think it could be sold to a wider public. That's something that need not be combined, but that could be a political game breaker in a way that brings this into the political agenda. I've seen a second question by Ludmila Nurse. Should I address this now, Hanya, or should I let others go first? Okay, so that was, again, a very salient question about whether the triple win argument need not be broken down or differentiated by gender, age, and family status. And that's absolutely true. You know, temporary labor migration schemes can be very different for let's say, construction workers or female caregivers, live-in domestic caregivers, which are exclusively women nearly. You need different types of programs for this. And one way how not to do it can be shown by looking at my own country, Austria, that has recently decided to reduce the child benefits for non-citizens to the level of their countries of origin, which means in practice that the female caregivers that come from Romania or Slovakia will lose a lot on the cost of living difference between Austria and their countries of origin, where the child benefit was a substantial part of their income. That just means it becomes much less attractive for these people to engage in these work. And it also means that they will find it more difficult to arrange the care responsibilities that they have for their children that they have to leave behind, which is extremely hard. There is a high price they are willing to pay for engaging in this temporary labor migration scheme. So we need to be extremely sensitive about gender-specific aspects, age-specific aspects, and family status in all of these programs. That's just an important addition that needs to be made.
Thank you. The next question we have from Esther Roman is a question for Sara, but I would actually like to open it up to all panelists. I think this is a really relevant question about how academics can shift the government discourse interested in non-dependency and paternalism and orientation towards equity, potentially with a focus on research as we are all scholars of these policies themselves.
I'll just really quickly say, I think the really important point about that question is, that Esther points out, is that a lot of the work and research is funded by governments, and it comes right from the EU. Like, US doesn't fund any research anymore, so this is less of a problem here, right? Angel donors play a big role, for example, but that is a really, really hard question. I don't pretend to have answers on, but like, I think that one of the ways to think about integration, or as another questioner rightly claimed, is that like we're starting to see signs that this is just straight up assimilation, but it is to look outside of citizenship at these other policy areas, right? And just more inductively approach these different policies, like what Rainer was talking about. Like, so that's an example of a policy that definitely works against integration. We may miss it because it's not labeled as an integration policy, but it certainly produces the outcomes of integration that we're interested in. And I think that that's kind of a way that we can inductively approach the questions that we want to do, even if we sense that there's pressure or certain remit from the governing or funding authorities, right?
Can I jump in, since this was a question to all the audience? As Sara pointed out, researchers very often are caught in this dilemma that they receive most of the funding from government sources, and sometimes find it then difficult to speak out critically on government policies. I think in Europe, the situation has improved partly because of funding that comes from the EU, where there are often fewer strings attached, ERC grants and the big Horizon research schemes make it possible to raise open questions and to have big research programs that can address a wider public. But I think the most important point is, in terms of research ethics, people who do migration research should never sign up to contracts where they need to keep silent, on their results. They need to be a public voice by writing op-eds, by engaging in social networks, which I don't do personally, by making their results publicly available. That doesn't mean campaigning in a partisan way or joining a party, but just being a voice in the wider public that tries to shift the discourse in this way. This is all we can do. It also means we shouldn't be overestimating our role. We've witnessed in the pandemic the sudden role, of epidemiologists and virologists. Who've popped up, and here they were, and governments could hardly ignore them. I think migration scholars will rarely ever get that kind of voice. And we've seen the test in the 2015-16 refugee crisis, where their voices were not very prominent usually. But I think we also have to learn that lesson, that we need to find our own channels to communicate our results to the wider public, and without pretending that we can replace the democratic mechanism of elections and partisan mobilizations in civil society. You know, with some modesty, how far our expertise goes, but not keep it to ourselves or just to the governments that fund us. Government consultancy is fine, but it should never come at the expense of public voice on these issues.
Yeah, I think that this is really important, and it's a continuous challenge. And these problems, we are thinking and rethinking, and as we develop new relationships, I think with policymakers and activists and media, I think that we tend to divide our impact on either policy and politicians, and then on third sector and organizations. But I think that we have to learn how to engage with the media as well. Speaking from the UK, where the participation in Horizon 20 has been suspended or under question for a while, and therefore we have been more dependent on UK government funding that is reviewed by other academics. But a peculiarity of the British system is that we have a strong remit towards impact and have to usually tend to work with policy partners, or not politicians, but policy partners. One, I'm now engaged in two projects, and one is with the State Department, with their policy team, and it's a learning process. There are some opportunities, there are openings, and I think that there's just a learning process for us. I think that there is also the question to engage or not to engage, that many academics have a clear answer to that. But I think that at points in time, there are also opportunities, and you can have the opportunity to be listened on a particular very narrow aspect rather than framing overall. And the second is the opportunity of working and engaging more with local authorities and at the local level. This seems to go further than national politics and to have a real impact in people's lives. So I think that that's another venue that we can explore more. No, what do you think?
Thank you. And Sara preempted the next question that I was going to pose to both Sara and Roxana, this power of language. So Cecile Carlson asked about these concepts of integration and assimilation, but I think this is also relevant to Roxana's presentation about the language and naming of identities. So hoping that either of you, and Rainer, if you would like to jump in as well, about the power of language within these policies.
Yeah, really quickly I answered, but there's this continuing debate about if we use the term inclusion, integration, right? The term assimilation became stigmatized, but as I answered, I think we're pretty close to calling it what it is. You can't look at the Danish settlement policy for migrant origins, capping per residential community as anything but assimilation, right? It's the idea that group-based settlement perpetuates inequalities, but can also lead to radicalization. I mean, we've sort of seen all the different justifications for it. And I think paired with these kinds of emotional appeals for integration, that it's this amorphous belonging, it's complete this criteria, live here for a certain period of time, and now you're one of us. That's assimilation, right? We just don't use the term. But again, I think we're destigmatizing it, or not we here. I think governments are pretty close to destigmatizing it in a way that we'll start to see it reappear in national conversations.
Yeah. So on these terms, I've been using the term integration also. There are very clever people who try to stay away from it. But I think we have to be aware what makes it such a loaded concept today. And paradoxically, this is the disintegration of the host societies themselves, right? So they're deeply divided and polarized, between rural and city folks, in terms of party allegiances. I don't need to tell people in the US about the depths of polarization that these societies experience. And therefore, the integration of immigrants becomes such a loaded term that is raised to such high expectations, first with the civic turn and then with the more exclusionary versions that Sara has described. So these two things are linked. So I think we should be talking about integration, because for some types of immigrants, that is also important in order to flesh out their claims to rights, to status, to citizenship, that are forms of integration into a democratic society. But we should also be emphasizing that integration has certain limits in terms of the content that you can rightly put into it, so that it doesn't become cultural assimilation, as it does not just in Denmark. And we should also be emphasizing that societies themselves are becoming less integrated in sometimes avoidable and sometimes unavoidable ways. In Europe, you find forms of mobility, for example, among EU citizens, where the term integration is deliberately avoided. They are not supposed to integrate. They are mobile Europeans who can carry their rights with them. So integration is for the third country nationals, not for the internally mobile Europeans. Also in social terms, in sociological terms, they're exactly in the same situation very often. So we need to flesh out the complexities of this discourse, but also be aware that in highly mobile societies, not everybody wants to be integrated or should be integrated. And temporary labor migration schemes are not about integration. That would defeat their purpose. They are about people who intend to be there only for a temporary limited time period and to return. So let's not talk about integration, but about the conditions where, some form of coexistence that is fruitful for everybody would be possible for them.
I agree, Reinhard. I also think that what saves it for me, the integration concept, is also the opportunity to open dialogue with the wider public on these issues. And secondly, the financial resources that usually come attached. So usually there is an integration fund, there is a committee, there is a parliamentary group where that opens a platform and, for example, enables and funds things like language courses, and even fund a whole stream of third sector organizations and charities that are really vital for the development of these communities, and they provide key services. I think that that's really important, and I don't see a society where that happens without the integration agenda. The question is, of course, exactly what else keeps being added to that. But I think that there is still a point here to make, and also on the question of indicators. We also need to know sometimes where is the damage, where we can intervene, where we can target policies. So it's not just about stigmatizing, it's also about identifying and groups where we can put more resources and design positive action solutions for them. I still see redeeming features to some point, but I agree that there is a controversial term. It is a controversial term.
There's a question that I think is kind of related to the conversation as you're moving into now. This balance between what could be considered human rights of migrants and also considering the existing communities as citizen communities, potentially vis-a-vis resentment if migrants get same economic or political benefits as citizens, or potentially other downstream elements of this as well. I think this might be a question for everybody. And this is Shireen Miller's question.
So this is a hard question. I mean, I think that's why we're all pausing, right? I think Reiner said something, and I kind of had a surprising response about renationalize, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how did you put it, Reiner? That states have to reject the notion that they can exercise sovereignty over migration, right?
Yeah. Yes, more or less. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. But then we have to think about the role of the EU external border in that, right? And what states want the EU to do, what the EU has the authority to do, and what we do with this massive gap between the EU wanting to implement things like burden sharing or common standards of reception and states just not complying, right? Just not practicing, not listening to the Commission. There's a huge gap between capability, interest, and like any resources that go to migration policy go to migration control and to securitization. So I think there's also a mismatch between what policies can be effective at the border, the way that we can compartmentalize, as Reiner was saying, and where the incentives are, where, what states are. If it's all going to securitization, I don't think we have a morality of migration that matches up with the instruments that we have at the external border. And I'm not sure we want the EU, which is very technocratic. I mean, this is the point, right? If they're not the guardrail of liberalism, today was the first day we saw the Commission take Poland to task for judicial violations. Like, do we want them implementing a common European migration policy? Like something that's exceedingly technocratic, unwilling to really uphold liberal democracy or hold authoritarians' feet to the fire, then we may not have a morality in place that can execute the kind of migration policies that we would hope for from a normative perspective.
I think Shirin's question, if I understood it well, was hinting more at the question of migrants already inside and how should we balance their human rights against citizens' claim to have exclusive rights for themselves, including their economic benefits and welfare, etc. So, but I think I can connect it with Sara's point just now that this is also something to do with the way we think about claims to being admitted of immigrants in the first place and who should decide on this. And what I wanted to, also in my talk to suggest is there is something in between an open border vision as the only moral and defensible purpose, a regime as some cosmopolitans think on the one hand, and the idea that if we don't have open borders, then nation states have a sovereign right to control immigration and set overall quota, and they can decide how many and whom they let in. And the reality is somewhere in between. Already in Europe, there are categories of migrants that have different kinds of admission claims. And their admission claims, and these are very, very different for temporary migrants, for international students, for refugees, for family members, and for the free-moving Europeans, and you cannot apply the same rationale to all of these. But if you accept that for each of these, there are reasons to keep borders not fully open, except for the free movement case, but it open in a controlled way, so that the reasonable claims can be justified. People can come in because they have these claims, but not everybody can come in and raise the same claims. Then that translates also, I think, into claims they have once they have been admitted. So if you admit, refugees, you cannot keep them in an asylum procedure for years and years and years and keep them away from the labor market. There has to be a point when asylum seekers become regular members of society and are no longer treated like those people whose claims still have to be examined because we want to deter as many as possible. So the difference between the rights of the members of society and the rights of the newcomers should be blurred and have been blurred. So that's the whole point of a liberal form of integration policy, that you don't make these clear-cut distinctions between newcomers and natives, but that you see the natives themselves being constantly changed in their composition by the newcomers, and the two types of groups having similar types of rights because of a liberal citizenship regime, where also the status of citizenship and the rights of citizenship can become disconnected to a certain extent. That, I think, is an achievement of the last years, the last decades of the 20th century, that needs to be preserved against the counterattacks that we are seeing today that come from right-wing populists and culturally conservatives. And if we don't defend it, we will fall back into closed versions of societies, both in terms of who has a right to enter them, but also closed internally into newly defined groups of cultural majorities of a native kind that pretend that they are pure and homogeneous and can keep the outsiders, even if not outside the territory, then as a lesser state, at a lesser status where they just serve the society for functional purposes but don't become members. It's defining an inclusive concept of membership that has to go together with these limited, reasonable forms of openness for the different migration claims. And the point is that cannot be reduced to human rights. The human rights discourse is limited in that sense. Human rights are what people can claim universally the world over, independently of their memberships. And what we need to acknowledge is that migrants acquire, sometimes they have already membership claims before they enter, But even if they don't have these pre-entry membership claims because they're family members or because they're European Union citizens or whatever, then they acquire membership claims once they've entered and settled. And membership claims are no longer universal. They are based on the idea that these people belong now in a particular way to a particular society. And they should not be just guaranteed their human rights, but they should have membership rights that eventually become citizenship rights. That, I think, is the progressive vision of migrant integration that needs to be defended.
Yeah, I think that this is really important. And in Britain, with Brexit, and it took me a while to bring the B word, but it has come up. We do see this redrawing of borders and redesigning immigration policy. So there are many opportunities available, and we can see a reconfiguration and a substitution of freedom of movement with other forms, precisely more temporary based schemes. The question would be then, I like this in Rainer's talk, particularly the argument for temporary schemes is the temporal aspect of rights and mobility. Membership rights once in the country and claims to mobility rights to enter prior. And how to organize this in very polarized democracies. We see, here we've had Brexit with 52 to 48%. It's not who are the citizens who are represented in the new politics, in the new policy of migration. It's not the entire, not all citizens are, and some are quite hurt by and feel betrayed because they've lost their EU citizenship. Many British citizens have lost their EU citizenship now because of Brexit. And this is not what they voted for. There are quite interesting questions here. If it is the right of the citizens, whose citizens? Because the political systems we have are very different and they don't always represent the final political immigration policy doesn't represent all the rights. And then it changes as well very quickly. The government and their composition changes. Even we have different versions of Brexit on the table, even though we had a vote for Brexit. So how do we navigate and accommodate these changing views of the citizens and to match the immigration system and also incorporate the claims of migrants to some extent at least, because currently they aren't fully represented. And the second question I had is in this dichotomy of the non-citizen would be migrant and the citizen, there's the other part of client politics and lobby groups that are receiving their needs are better represented in the immigration policy. We see different sectors like IT or agriculture, even low skill, that are receiving, that are listened to, and then you see those needs represented. I just wanted to make that remark as well, that note.
Thanks. Maybe if we could quickly answer the last question. I think it's kind of like I don't know, we're all on Zoom, so I think it's relevant that we ask a COVID pandemic question. And this is kind of a related question from Alan Sibanu and Hanwei Lee about how the COVID pandemic has affected these larger policies we're thinking about. So Alvin is asking specifically about the liberal paradox, of immigration, Hollifield, while Hanwei Lee is thinking about the role of multiculturalism specifically and the rise of violent acts against minorities in the world.
So let me try with the liberal paradox. So Jim Hollifield stated the liberal paradox as a tension between economic liberalism and political liberalism. Economic liberalism being in favor of more openness for immigration, and political liberalism being in favor of, maybe citizenship access for those who have been admitted, but also because of democratic majorities that usually want to have fewer immigrants being more closed towards immigration as such. Now, I'm not sure the pandemic itself is going to change that fundamental tension between the two sides. I've also tried to argue, and that's part of what I've laid out in my own talk, that the idea that political liberalism or democracy is per se foreclosure towards immigrants may be misstating the idea. The notion to which extent democracies have to be open for immigration because of their democratic norms and commitments. Now, how will the pandemic affect this? The pandemic, I think, is not going to reduce the demand for migration. It has already cut down on mobility in a big way. And there have been new forms of border controls in Europe that we wouldn't imagine we would see in our lifetime. But I don't expect this to be a lasting effect. There may be lasting lower levels of mobility and higher costs, for example, of frequent flying, et cetera, but we shouldn't confuse this with migration. Migration is driven by other dynamics. This is about economic disparities between the global north and the global south, opportunities that are strong in the north and the south. And it's about refugees and the crisis that won't be in any way resolved, but probably exacerbated by the pandemic, and much more important by the climate crisis that we are already in the middle of without being fully aware of its consequences for migration. So we are going to see more migration pull and more migration push factors, because maybe more the climate crisis than the pandemic. And this means the old questions are not going away. We need to deal with them. The worst possible outcome would be that the pandemic strengthens the forces of protectionist, nationalist closure of societies. That cannot be ruled out. That would be a replication of what happened 100 years ago after the Spanish flu and World War I and the Roaring 20s. We saw the national closures in the 30s around the Western world. That's a possible dystopian scenario. But on the other hand, the situation is different in the sense that both the pandemic and the climate crisis are very clearly global crises that call for global solutions and cooperation. And there are some positive signs in the pandemic too, where global cooperation has happened with the COVAX initiatives and similar things. So on the optimistic side, I would count that global cooperation would also lead to more migration and development cooperations in the long run, as the price for getting the global south to cooperate with the global north. And if that happens, then we might build migration channels of a legal kind into this kind of new stage of globalization that will be less driven by neoliberalism. This is Jim Holyfield's idea. This is what drove immigration openness in the past. But it might be driven by a new version of globalization that is more was more to do with democracy and political liberalism. So that would eventually help to overcome the paradox, but that's maybe a very optimistic view. It's one of two possible outcomes.
It's been a wonderful discussion. So I want to thank all of our attendees and, of course, our three panelists and Hannah for her excellent job moderating. Like I said, we do have another related panel next week, and we will circulate that to everyone who registered for this just out of ease. So hopefully some people will be able to attend that and also engage in the broader discussion on what is clearly an important and ongoing debate and discussion on the topic. So for our remaining attendees who've endured, thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you really very much, especially from attending from all sorts of parts under all sorts of conditions. I hope that you have, depending on your time zone, a lovely morning, a wonderful afternoon, or a pleasant evening. Thank you very much to everyone. Have a good rest of the day.